Enchantments and Desolations. Part 1. Marius, drawn by that force which pushes iron toward the magnet, and the lover toward the stones of which the house of her whom he loves is built, had finally entered Cosette's garden as Romeo did the garden of Juliet. It had been even easier for him than for Romeo. Romeo was obliged to scale a wall. Marius had only to push aside a little one of the bars of the decrepit grating, which was loosened in its rusty socket, like the teeth of old people. Marius was slender and easily passed through. As there was never anybody in the street, and as, moreover, Marius entered the garden only at night, he ran no risk of being seen. From that blessed and holy hour when a kiss affianced these two souls, Marius came every evening. Through all the month of May of that year, 1832, there were every night in that poor wild garden, under that shrubbery, each day more odorous and more dense, two beings composed of every chastity and every innocence, overflowing with all the felicities of heaven, more nearly archangels than men, pure, noble, intoxicated, radiant, who were resplendent to each other in the darkness. What passed between these two beings? Nothing. They were adoring each other. At night, when they were there, this garden seemed a living and sacred place. All the flowers opened about them and proffered them their incense. They too opened their souls and poured them forth to the flowers. The lusty and vigorous vegetation trembled full of sap and intoxication about these two innocent creatures, and they spoke words of love at which the trees trilled. Their existence was vague, bewildered with happiness. They did not perceive the cholera which decimated Paris that very month. They had been as confidential with each other as they could be, but this had not gone very far beyond their names. Marius had told Cosette that he was an orphan, that his name was Marius Pontmercy, that he was a lawyer, that he lived by writing things for publishers, that his father was a colonel, that he was a hero, and that he, Marius, had quarrelled with his grandfather, who was rich. He had also said something about being a baron, but that had produced no effect on Cosette. Marius, a baron? She did not comprehend. She did not know what that word meant. Marius was Marius. On her part, she had confided to him that she had been brought up at the convent of the Petit Picpus, that her mother was dead as well as his, that her father's name was Monsieur Fauchelevent, that he was very kind, that he gave much to the poor, but that he was poor himself, and he deprived himself of everything, while he deprived her of nothing. Strange to say, in the kind of symphony in which Marius had been living since he had seen Cosette, the past, even the most recent, had become so confused and distant to him that what Cosette told him satisfied him fully. He did not even think to speak to her of the night adventure at the Gorbeau tenement, the Thénardiers, the burning, and the strange attitude and singular flight of her father. Marius had temporarily forgotten all of that. He did not even know at night what he had done in the morning, nor where he had breakfasted, nor who had spoken to him. He had songs in his ear which rendered him deaf to every other thought. He existed only during the hours in which he saw Cosette. Then, as he was in heaven, it was quite natural that he should forget the earth. They were both supporting with languor the indefinable burden of the material pleasures. Thus live these somnambulists called lovers. Alas, who has not experienced all these things? Why comes there an hour when we leave this azure, and why does life continue afterward? These two beings, then, were living thus very high, with the improbability of nature, neither at the nadir nor at the zenith, between man and the seraph, above earth, below the ether, in the cloud, scarcely flesh and bone, soul and ecstasy from head to foot, too sublimated already to walk upon the earth, and yet too much weighed down with humanity to disappear in the sky, in suspension like atoms which are awaiting precipitation, apparently outside of destiny, ignoring that beaten track yesterday, today, tomorrow, astounded, swooping, floating at times, light enough to soar into infinity, almost ready for the eternal flight. They were sleeping awake in this rocking cradle, O splendid lethargy of the real, overwhelmed by the ideal. Sometimes, beautiful as was Cosette, Marius closed his eyes before her. With closed eyes is the best way at looking at the soul. Marius and Cosette did not ask where this would lead them. They looked upon themselves as arrived. It is a strange demand for men to ask that love should any whither. Part 2. Jean Valjean suspected nothing. Cosette, a little less dreamy than Marius, was cheerful, and that was enough to make Jean Valjean happy. The thoughts of Cosette, her tender preoccupations, the image of Marius which filled her soul, detracted nothing from the incomparable purity of her beautiful, chaste, and smiling forehead. She was at the age where the maiden bears her love as the angel bears her lily. And then, when two lovers have an understanding, they always get along well. Any third person who might disturb their love is kept in perfect blindness by very few precautions, always the same for all lovers. Thus, never any objections from Cosette to Jean Valjean. Did he wish to take a walk? Yes, my dear father. Did he wish to remain at home? Very well. Would he spend the evening with Cosette? She was in raptures. As he always retired at 10 o'clock, at such times Marius would not come to the garden until after that hour, when from the street he would hear Cosette open the glass door leading out onto the steps. We need not say that Marius was never met by day. Jean Valjean no longer even thought Marius was in existence. Once, only one morning, he happened to say to Cosette, "Why, you have something white on your back." The evening before, Marius in a transport had pressed Cosette against the wall. Old Toussaint, who went to bed early, thought of nothing but going to sleep, once her work was done, and was ignorant of all, like Jean Valjean. Never did Marius set foot in the house. When he was with Cosette, they hid themselves in a recess near the steps, so they could neither be seen nor heard from the street, and they sat there, contenting themselves often, by way of conversation, with pressing each other's hands 20 times a minute, while looking into the branches of the trees. At such moments a thunderbolt might have fallen within 30 paces of them, and they would not have suspected it, so deeply was the reverie of one absorbed and buried in the reverie of the other. Meanwhile, various complications were approaching. One evening, Marius was making his way to the rendezvous by the Boulevard des Invalides. He usually walked with his head bent down. As he was just turning the corner of the Rue Plumet, he heard someone saying very near him, "Good evening, Monsieur Marius." He looked up and recognized Éponine. This produced a singular effect upon him. He had not even thought once of this girl since the day she had brought him to the Rue Plumet. He had not seen her again, and she had completely gone out of his mind. He had only motives of gratitude toward her. He owed his present happiness to her, and still it was annoying to him to meet her. It is a mistake to suppose that passion, when it is fortunate and pure, leads man to a state of perfection. It leads him simply, as we have said, to a state of forgetfulness. In this situation, man forgets to be bad, but he also forgets to be good. Gratitude, duty, necessary and troublesome memories vanish. He answered with some embarrassment, "What? Is it you, Éponine?" "Why do you speak to me so sternly? Have I done anything to you?" "No," answered he. Certainly he had nothing against her, far from it. Only he felt that he could not do otherwise, now that he had whispered to Cosette, than to speak coldly to Éponine. As he was silent, she exclaimed, "Tell me how." Then she stopped. It seemed as if words failed this creature, once so reckless and so bold. She attempted to smile and could not. She resumed, "Well." Then she was silent again, and stood with her eyes cast down. "Good evening, Monsieur Marius," she said, all at once abruptly, and she went away. Part 3. The next day, it was the 3rd of June, the 3rd of June, 1832, a date which must be noted on account of the grave events which were at that time suspended over the horizon of Paris like thunderclouds. Marius at nightfall was following the same path as the evening before, with the same rapturous thoughts in his heart, when he perceived, under the trees of the boulevard, Éponine approaching him. 2 days in succession, this was too much. He turned hastily, left the boulevard, changed his route, and went to the Rue Plumet through the Rue Monsieur. This caused Éponine to follow him to the Rue Plumet, a thing which she had not done before. She had been content until then to see him on his way through the boulevard without even seeking to meet him. The evening previous only had she tried to speak to him. Éponine followed him then, without a suspicion on his part. She saw him push aside the bar of the grating and glide into the garden. "Why," said she, "he is going into the house." She approached the grating, felt of the bars one after another, and easily recognized the one which Marius had displaced. She murmured in an undertone, with a mournful accent, "None of that, Lisette." She sat down upon the surbase of the grating, close beside the bar, as if she were guarding it. It was just at the point at which the grating joined the neighboring wall. There was an obscure corner there, in which Éponine was entirely hidden. She remained thus for more than an hour, without stirring and without breathing, a prey to her own thoughts. About 10 o'clock in the evening, one of the 2 or 3 passers in the Rue Plumet, a belated old bourgeois, who was hurrying through this deserted and ill-famed place, keeping along the garden grating, on reaching the angle which the grating made with the wall, heard a sullen and threatening voice which said, "I'm not surprised that he comes here every evening." He cast his eyes about him, saw nobody, dared not to look into that dark corner, and was very much frightened. He doubled his pace. Part 4. Meanwhile, Marius was with Cosette. Never had the sky been more studded with stars, or more charming, the trees more tremulous, the odor of the shrubs more penetrating. Never had the birds gone to sleep in the leaves with a softer sound. Never had all the harmonies of the universal serenity better responded to the interior music of love. Never had Marius been more enamored, more happy, more in ecstasy. But he had found Cosette sad. Cosette had been weeping. Her eyes were red. It was the first cloud in this wonderful dream. Mary's first words were, "What is the matter?" "See." Then she sat down on the seat near the stairs, and as he took his place all trembling beside her, she continued, "My father told me this morning to hold myself in readiness, that he had business, and perhaps we should go away." Marius shuddered from head to foot. When we are at the end of life, to die means to go away. When we are at the beginning, to go away means to die. For 6 weeks, Marius gradually, slowly by degrees, had been each day taking possession of Cosette, a possession entirely ideal but thorough. Marius then possessed Cosette as minds possess, but he wrapped her in his whole soul, and clasped her jealously with an incredible conviction. To have Cosette, to possess Cosette, this to him was not separable from breathing. Into the midst of this faith, of this intoxication, of this virginal possession, marvelous and absolute, of this sovereignty, these words, "We are going away," fell all at once, and the sharp voice of reality cried to him, "Cosette is not yours." Marius awoke. For 6 weeks Marius had lived, as we have said, outside of life. These words, "going away," brought him roughly back into it. He could not find a word. She said to him in her turn, "What is the matter?" He answered so low that Cosette hardly heard him. "I don't understand what you have said." She resumed, "This morning my father told me to arrange all my little affairs and to be ready, that he would give me his clothes to pack, that he was obliged to take a journey, that we were going away, that we must have a large trunk for me and a small one for him, to get all that ready within a week from now, and that we should go, perhaps, to England." "But it is monstrous!" exclaimed Marius. He asked in a feeble voice, "And when would you start?" "He didn't say when." "And when should you return?" "He didn't say when." Marius arose and said coldly, "Cosette, shall you go?" Cosette took Marius' hand and pressed it without answering. "Very well," said Marius. "Then I shall go elsewhere." Cosette felt the meaning of this word still more than she understood it. She turned so pale that her face became white in the darkness. She stammered, "What do you mean?" Marius looked at her, then slowly raised his eyes toward heaven and answered, "Nothing." When his eyes were lowered, he saw Cosette smiling upon him. The smile of the woman whom we love has a brilliancy which we see by night. "How stupid we are! Marius, I have an idea." "What?" "Go if we go. I will tell you where. Come and join me where I am." Marius was now a man entirely awakened. He had fallen back into reality. He cried to Cosette, "Go with you? Are you mad? But it takes money, and I have none. Go to England? I have not the means to pay for a passport." He threw himself against a tree which was nearby, standing with his arms above his head, his forehead against the bark, feeling neither the tree which was chafing his skin, nor the fever which was hammering his temples, motionless and ready to fall like a statue of despair. He was a long time thus. One might remain through eternity in such abysses. At last he turned. He heard behind him a little stifled sound, soft and sad. It was Cosette, sobbing. She had been weeping for more than 2 hours, while Marius had been thinking. He came to her, fell on his knees, and prostrating himself slowly, he took the tip of her foot, which peeped from under her dress, and kissed it. "Now listen," said he. "Do not expect me tomorrow." "Why not?" "Do not expect me until the day after tomorrow." "Oh, why not?" "You will see." "A day without seeing you? Why, that is impossible." "Let us sacrifice one day to gain perhaps a whole life." "You wish it?" "Yes, Cosette." He took his head in both her hands, rising on tiptoe to reach his height, and striving to see hope in his eyes. Marius continued, "It occurs to me. You must know my address. Something may happen we don't know. I live with a friend named Courfeyrac, Rue de la Verrerie, number 16. He put his hand in his pocket, took out a penknife, and wrote with the blade upon the plastering of the wall, 16, Rue de la Verrerie. Cosette, meanwhile, began to look into his eyes again. "Day after tomorrow, You'll come early. I expect you at 9 o'clock at night, 9 o'clock precisely. I forewarn you. Oh dear, how sad it is that the days are long. You understand, when the clock strikes 9, I shall be in the garden. And I too. And without saying it, moved by the same thought, drawn on by those electric currents which put two lovers in continual communication, both intoxicated with pleasure, even in their grief, they fell into each other's arms, without perceiving that their lips were joined, while their uplifted eyes, overflowing with ecstasy and full of tears, were fixed upon the stars.